Hi, welcome to Communication 200, Mass Communication and Society. This is Professor Jody Gehrman, and today we're going to be reviewing Chapter 3, Sound Recording and Popular Music. Our chapter begins with a really interesting recounting of Radiohead's experiment, where they found themselves out of contract and they turned down several offers for multi-million-dollar contracts in order to offer their album online with a pay-what-you-wish policy. The success of this project inspired many other recording artists to try the same thing. Next, our authors step back a little bit and look at the long history of intergenerational tension around popular music and dance styles. In the 1700s in Europe, waltz was outlawed and considered savage. 100 years later in Argentina, the upper class tried to ban tango music because its roots reached back to bars and bordellos. In the 1920s and the 1940s, jazz music was critiqued because it was free-form, anarchic, and it often inspired unrestrained dance crazes like the Charleston or the jitterbug. With the birth of rock and roll in the 1950s and hip-hop in the 1980s, we've seen additional chapters in this age-old battle between generations, each one decrying the new form of music as immoral. But let's step back much further and look at the development of sound recording technology. In the 1850s, the French printer Edward Léon Scott de Martinville conducted the first experiments with sound recording. He used hog's hair bristle as a needle, and he tied one end to a thin membrane stretched over the narrow part of a funnel. In 1877, Thomas Edison was able to play back sound by recording his own voice using a needle to press his voice's sound waves into tinfoil wrapped around a metal cylinder about the size of a cardboard toilet paper roll. This became known as Edison's phonograph. Then in 1887, using some of the ideas from Edison, Emil Berliner, a German engineer, created the Berliner flat discs and the gramophones to play it. In the early 1900s, the Victor Talking Machine Company placed the hardware for the record player inside pieces of furniture, and these were known as Victrolas. They had to be primed with a crank handle. In 1925, electric record players became available and gradually started to replace Victrolas as more and more homes had electricity. In the early 1940s, audio tape was developed in Germany for the first time, allowing multi-track recording. Stereophonic sound was invented in 1931 by Alan Blumlein, but it wasn't put into commercial use until 1958. It allowed the recording of two separate channels or tracks. In 1983, the first CDs hit the market, but the biggest recording advancement came in the 1970s when electrical engineer Thomas Stockham made the first digital audio recordings on standard computer equipment. The MP3 file format was developed in 1992, and it enables digital recordings to be compressed into smaller, more manageable files. Here you can see a fairly simplified timeline of the music industry's developments of various genres and formats. In the late 90s, programs like Napster allowed music fans to share files. In 2001, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the music industry against Napster, saying that music file swapping was illegal and violated copyright laws. Since its debut in April of 2003, iTunes has gone from just an intriguing idea to the world's #1 music retailer. The future seems to be in the cloud, so that's music that is never downloaded but is synchronized between mobile devices. That seems to be where we're headed. The recording industry and radio have always been closely linked, but they've had a rocky relationship. In 1914, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers was founded to collect copyright fees from music publishers and writers. By 1924, record sales had dropped by half because of competition with radio. Early 1950s, the radio industry and the recording industry banded together against television. In 2010, the music industry proposed charging royalty fees for playing music on the air, something radio stations opposed. Although people often assume that pop music was born with the phonograph and the radio, it actually existed even before this. First pop vocalists of the 20th century were products of the vaudeville circuit, which radio, movies, and the Depression would bring to an end in the 1930s. Jazz originated in New Orleans. It was improvisational, and the term itself is a slang word for sex, so it was instantly controversial, but very, very influential. The cultural storm known as rock and roll hit in the mid-1950s. This was also a slang term for sex, so it was also, like jazz, instantly controversial. The migration of Southern American blacks into northern cities searching for better jobs during the first half of the 20th century helped to spread different music styles, especially blues. During the same period, the blues-based urban black music known as rhythm and blues started to blossom. R&B was banned on many radio stations in the beginning because of its sexually explicit lyrics. In the 1950s, rock really started to blur some social boundaries that had been rigid before then. For example, when Chuck Berry wrote and performed Roll Over Beethoven, he mixed rock lyrics and rhythms with references to classical music. Little Richard was dubbed rock and roll's first drag queen, and he habitually blurred the boundary between masculinity and femininity. He laid the groundwork for artists like Elton John, David Bowie, and Prince, who all tended to blur those lines as well. White artists like Carl Perkins and Buddy Holly combined country music, Southern gospel, and Mississippi Delta blues to create a sound called rockabilly. Rock also combined Northern and Southern influences. Legendary record producer Sam Phillips of Sun Records claimed that the key to selling records was to find a white man who sounded black, i.e. Elvis.
Ready, set, go and go. I got a gal that I love so. Ready to rock and roll. Going down to the corner, pick on my sweetie pie. She's my rock and roll baby, she's out for rock and roll, not a hot top cat, not a dongery dog. I headed to the gym, to the sock hop ball. The gum and the cats are going wild. The music really send my day to ready to rock and roll.
Lastly, rock blurred the lines between the sacred and the secular. Artists like Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Ray Charles had deep ties to religion and were inspired in many ways by religious music of their childhoods. In the 1950s, many songs originally written and performed by black R&B artists were then handed over to white artists who would sometimes get illegitimate co-writing credit and would often get most of the money, while the black artists never saw a penny in royalties. A prime example of this would be Pat Boone, known as King of Cover Music. When he covered Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame, it went to #1 and stayed on the top 40 chart for 20 weeks, whereas Domino's original only made it to #10. After watching Boone outsell his song Tutti Frutti in 1956, Little Richard wrote Long Tall Sally, specifically in a way that he felt Boone would not be able to replicate. And he was successful. His version went to #6, whereas Boone's version only got to #8. In 1958, Ray Charles covered I Can't Stop Loving You by country's Don Gibson. This was the first time that a black artist covered a white artist's song and had a #1 pop hit. The payola scandals of the 1950s were a huge controversy. Payola is the practice of record promoters paying DJs to play particular songs. Alan Freed, Dick Clark, and many others had their careers ended or tarnished by the payola scandal. Although payola is now illegal, as recently as 2005, there have been payola lawsuits. In the early part of the 1960s, rock and roll felt a little tamer than it had, although there were new girl groups like the Crystals and the Ronettes. Then in 1964, the Beatles invaded America with their pop reinterpretations of American blues and rock and roll. Ed Sullivan was really key in promoting the Beatles on his show, and he had very different feelings, though, about the Rolling Stones, who were perceived as kind of the bad boys of rock and roll. In 1967, Sullivan pressured the Rolling Stones into changing their song from "Let's Spend the Night Together" to "Let's Spend Some Time Together." Although the British invasion drew much of its inspiration from black influences, they were drawing listeners away from a whole new generation of black performers. Gradually, though, in the 1960s, black singers like James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Otis Redding, and Ike and Tina Turner found diverse audiences. The most prominent independent label, which nourished soul and black popular music, was Motown, which was started in 1959 by a former Detroit auto worker, Berry Gordy, with $700. He named it after Detroit's nickname, Motor City. Among Motown's many music legends are Diana Ross's Supremes and Marvin Gaye. Also in the 1960s, folk music became a really important part of social protests. Artists like Woody Guthrie in the 1930s inspired people like Bob Dylan. There was a tremendous amount of social upheaval at this time, and music gave voice to the movement against Vietnam, the women's movement, the environmental movement, and the civil rights movement. Although the link between alcohol, drugs, and rock and roll have never been very private, this link became much more public in the late 1960s when LSD was being experimented with. Lots of groups and performers of the psychedelic era, like Jefferson Airplane, Big Brother and the Holding Company with Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, and the Grateful Dead, believed that artistic expression could be enhanced by mind-altering drugs like LSD. Rock music in the 70s was increasingly seen as just another part of mainstream culture, with faceless bands like REO Speedwagon and Styx. Then, in the late 1970s, punk revives rock's rebelliousness and brought us back to the basics of simple chord structures, catchy melodies, and politically or socially challenging lyrics. Then, in the 1990s, grunge came along and updated the spirit of punk. It takes its name from the distorted guitar sound and torn jeans, flannel shirts of its musicians and fans. Artists like Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, Green Day, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, The Breeders, Hole, Nine Inch Nails, and many others. Both punk and grunge are considered subcategories of the fringe movement's alternative rock, though grunge was much more commercially successful than punk. In the 1980s, hip-hop emerged as a much more political form of music than soul. In 1982, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five released The Message, which forever infused hip-hop with a political take on ghetto life. In 1985, Run DMC's album Raising Hell became a major crossover hit, the first hip-hop album to reach #1 on the pop charts. Rap continues to be extremely controversial. On the one hand, it's a great forum for performers to debate issues of gender, class, sexuality, violence, and drugs. On the other hand, like punk, it's often drawn criticism for lyrics that degrade women, espouse homophobia, and applaud violence. The recording industry experienced significant losses beginning in 2000 as file sharing began to undercut CD sales. After the 1980s, a few large, powerful companies started swallowing up the independent labels, which resulted in a global oligopoly with only 4 major music corporations remaining. Those corporations are Sony, Universal Music Group, EMI, and Warner Music Group. In contrast, there are something like 5,000 small indie labels whose role in the music industry is primarily to discover new music trends before they get big. Labels are driven by A&R, or artist and repertoire agents, the talent scouts for the music business who discover, develop, and sometimes manage artists. The producer handles most of the non-technical elements of the session, like getting the studio space or hiring session musicians if necessary. In just 1 decade, internet sales have grown and captured 40% of the US market and 27% of the global market. No matter how music is produced or distributed, it endures because it speaks to individual and universal themes, from first romantic adventures to outrage over social injustice. The question now is, with these major corporations controlling most of the industry, how can music continue to be a viable force for social protest and diversity? Thanks for listening. Next week, we'll be talking about popular radio and the history of broadcasting.